And before we get started, I want to show you something. So if you'll just turn in your Bible, let me see if I can find it. It's in Revelation 10:9. Revelation 10:9. And the reason this comes up is because, we have the interaction in class, but sometimes our discussions in class, they don't always stay right with the Torah portion itself. We tend to go off on some other trails. But we do get questions back from the students who were just getting the recordings or watching the recordings. And sometimes they have different questions. And if I can, I try to address it somehow in a future lesson if I possibly can. And one of the questions I got from last week, I think, was from a video on the Torah portion 2 years ago. Regardless, it's the same Torah portion. And they were asking pretty much about a comment I had made about the thirds of judgment in Revelation and how some of these judgments are coming in thirds, like a third of the earth will be burned up and so forth. And I mentioned that there's a background for this in the Jewish tradition, which says that prior to the Great Flood, that Adonai noticed the problems and he sent them a warning. He sent them a pre-flood flood. And in the tradition, it said that destroyed a third of the earth, a third of the people in the earth. And of course, they didn't take heart. They didn't take heed to that. And so later he sends the great flood in the time of Noah. And, the question is, where's that in the Bible? Well, it's not in the Bible that I know of anywhere but the book of Revelation. So if Revelation is the first place that you see a Jewish tradition, we might have a disconnect already. And that's been my wonder for a long time. So much of Revelation is written with not just Jewish interpretations of biblical symbols. It's also full of Jewish tradition, not just from the Midrash, but from the Mishnah, things that would only be handed down if you had some degree of acquaintance with a synagogue or with observant Jews. And so I thought, let me just give you another example out of this Torah portion. And I think I mentioned last night that the book of Devarim is called the Mishneh Torah. It's the little Torah. It's the little scroll. It's the condensed version of the entire Torah. You get a few added details, but for much of it, just like we see here in Devarim starting off, we see it's a recap of things that have happened before. And there's a reason for that. But the idea that in the tradition, it's seen as the Mishneh Torah, the retelling of the Torah, as opposed to the great scroll of the Torah, it's the little scroll of the Torah. And we also know that the Torah is likened to honey and the honeycomb. And so when we look at Revelation 10:9, it says, so I went to the angel telling him to give me the little book. Some versions will say the little scroll. And he said to me, take it and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but in your mouth, it will be sweet as honey. I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it. And in my mouth, it was as sweet as honey. And when I had eaten it, my stomach was made bitter. And we've looked at that passage before in the context of the trial of the Sotah, the trial of the woman accused, because the symbolism there is when you commit adultery, it might be sweet at the time. What does it say? Stolen waters are sweet, but then afterward it turns bitter. And that's what happens when she drinks the water that has the words of the Torah that are rubbed off into, and it has the sacred name rubbed off into it and dissolved in there. It might have been fun sinning, but now that you have to swallow the consequences of it, that sweetness is going to be made into bitterness. But there's another tradition that we can look at in this passage, and it has to do with the little scroll or the little book, and Devarim as being the summary of the Torah. And in the tradition, if we read in the Midrash, it tells us that when Moses sits down to expand what we would say is the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, he realizes his days are literally numbered, because once it's time to go in, remember, he's speaking to the second generation at this point. The warriors who rebelled in the wilderness, they have also fallen in the wilderness. So at this point, he's dealing with their children and their grandchildren. And so he's expounding to them. And according to the Midrash, as he expounds the book of Devarim specifically, that's beginning in this Torah portion this week, the Midrash tells us that not only did he explain the book to them in Hebrew, he expounded this book in the 70 languages of the world. They say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, if we keep reading in verse 11, John says, and they said to me, you must prophesy again concerning many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. And so it puts the little scroll inside of John, knowing that it represents the summary of the Torah. And now he says, now you're going to have to speak to many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. And this is exactly what Moses has been sitting here doing. We say this is, wonderful. He's expounding the Torah. But if you've taken a gander at these first few chapters of Devarim, it's a strong, strong rebuke, because they have taken that which was life and sweet and wonderful and excellent and perfect and infinite. They have taken it, and because of their rebellion, because of their disobedience, they have caused the sweetness of that encounter at Sinai in many cases in the wilderness to be turned to bitterness because of their adultery and their idolatry. They're, like he says, playing the whore with Baal Peor, playing the whore with the golden calf. And so this section to John's listeners in the first century would have been very familiar, not just in the reference to the trial of the Sotah, but also in reference to this Torah portion that we're about to unpack. What Moses is doing in this moment, and the fact that he has to show them how this Torah turned bitter to this last generation. And then somehow the Jews are being told, this is going to be what the Midrash says, we would say Israel, they're being explained this information in the 70 nations of the world, and not really knowing what the point of that tradition is. The rabbis comment that, well, the reason that he explained this in the 70 nations of the world is because the Jews would be exiled. And therefore, he taught them the perfect explanation in that tongue so that they wouldn't have to rely upon a translation made from people who spoke those tongues, who might distort the proper meaning of the Hebrew text. And so he expounded it to them, and somehow this was going to be passed down. And I'm not diminishing that. But we also know that if we keep reading in the Brit HaChadashah, that there is a prophecy that this gospel is going to be preached in all the world. And so once this gospel is preached into all the world, in essence, the little scroll has been handed to the many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. And so how they receive that little scroll, that little book, can either be like the Israelites, the basis for them to go in and to inherit, but it could also be the basis for it to turn bitter in their own stomachs. And so that just gives you another example, and I know we can give multiple ones, but that particular example I think is really good because it deals directly with today's Torah portion, which is Devarim. And if you can see that relationship, I think it gives you a more balanced view when you read the Mishnah, when you read the Midrash, and you may not make a practice of it. You may do it occasionally when you run into something like this and you say, well, is there something in the Jewish tradition that might explain more than what I'm getting on the surface level? That's the benefit. Once you achieve some clarity and you put down that foundation of the books of the Torah and those literal levels of it, after a while, like I say, when you kind of get your legs under you with the Torah, then it doesn't hurt to start investigating some of these other sources because it can lend clarity as it does here in Revelation chapter 10. So that's just an encouragement to you. I know there's lots of debate about the Jewish sources. I don't want to really jump into that debate because to me, it's what you do is your debate. The way you live your life is your debate. And so sometimes we don't need to write a treatise. We don't need to write an essay. We don't need to make a Facebook post. We just need to live our convictions before others. And to me, that thunders much more loudly than an argument. So if that helps you, there it is. Let's see. Shauna, absolutely. I don't know why she wouldn't have though, because she is she might need to start checking her spam, especially if she has Gmail. Gmail tends to hide stuff in the promotions folder, but she should absolutely be getting the invitations, at least on the sending end. What it's doing when it gets to the inbox, I'm not really sure, but absolutely send her the link so she can jump on with us. Okay, so let's get into where we left off last night. And just as a reminder, play from current slide, not the beginning. Here we go. In fact, let me stop for just a second. What I'm going to do, I'm going to make Colleen the co-host. So if we do have a hot mic at some point, she can work on that for me. There we go. Okay, now we're going to share the screen. So just as a reminder, Wednesday, tomorrow, yesterday it was day after tomorrow. Today is tomorrow. Tomorrow's Wednesday. Will be the 1st of Av. And we're entering into the 9 days that conclude the 3 weeks on the 9th of Av. And I don't want to recap everything I said last night, but I think it's worth saying again, be cautious during this time and don't pick a fight. This is not the season to pick a fight with anyone. Just stow it. Not a good season to start new things. There will be days and there will be seasons where the Spirit moves in such a way that there can be favorable times. Just like in the Psalm, it says, my prayer to you, O Lord, be at the right time. So it is possible to pray an untimely prayer. And as we look at the patterns of Scripture, there's timely and untimely things, seasons to do certain things. And so during this time, because we are on such high alert for calamity, and because we are guarding our clothes, guarding our deeds, we do want to be careful. Not just up until the 9th of Av, but even in that period after, because remember, the intensity is building from this point. It's not that after the 9th of Av, you can go, everything's safe. You need to guard your garments every single day. But remember, we're going to be building through Av, through the month of Elul with the blowing of the shofars, and then finally going into the 7th month, which is Tishrei. And so just consider your season and pick your battles. Be really, really careful, because if that battle is not divinely ordered, you might find yourself on the run. That's one thing I figured out. So we want to be careful there. All right, there's the calendar. This is a recommendation. If you're new to the Hebrew calendar, either of these Becky books are wonderful. They just give you a really good foundation. Let's see, we went over the Shema as being the prescription to help us deal with this particular season. It emphasizes, especially in the Torah portion, Va'etchanan, which we're approaching, that acknowledging the unity and the oneness of Yod He Vav He, that's the thing to hang on to during this season that's going to bring you through it and bring you out on the other side, along with all these other points that we've been looking at, like idolatry, adultery, sexual licentiousness, hatred among people, gossip, because the pattern is those particular sins are recompensed very harshly during this season. And the Israelites have found that out, that the closer they draw to the divine presence, then the greater the punishments and consequences for behaving casually with that presence. So we find ourselves here in Devarim with Moshe retracing their wilderness journey. And most of it is failure, by the way. I say this is not necessarily an encouraging lecture that he's giving. It would fall into the category of a musar lecture, a morality lecture, pointing out to them their mistakes so that they can be sure not to repeat them. And so what I want to do is connect this opening portion, Devarim, with the Hadvarim. You hear the same Hebrew word that ended up pursuing the Israelites after this calamity of the 9th of Av. In other words, in a nutshell, what we're going to say is you can either agree to let the supernatural bugs, the hornets, go before you, or you can choose to be chased by bees. It's up to you. And your response in your relationship to the word is going to determine whether the word is attacking on your behalf or whether you're being attacked by the very word. And so we want to be careful there. Let's see. And then last night we looked at Deuteronomy 1:19. And the critical thing here is the tripwire. They have at this point arrived at a place that's going to start activating some things. It's, okay, we've been talking about the land of Israel for hundreds of years now, since we went into exile. We've heard all about this wonderful land. And once they enter the hill country of the Amorites, now Moses says, and then he says it twice, the hill country of the Amorites, the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord is about to give us. See, he says, look with your eyes. The Lord has placed, and that Hebrew word there is natan. It means he gave the land before you. Go up, take possession, inherit it, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has spoken to you. Do not fear or be dismayed. He's reminding them that they've already been given the land. They've already been told about this place. And so he's not telling them to suit up for war. At this point, he just says, go see it. I want you to see this. He doesn't say go to battle, just go up. Allah, that's a resurrection hint. When you see that Hebrew shoresh, Allah, like the Olah offering, the going up offering, you're supposed to ascend. And so you're going to ascend, and then you're going to take possession of it. And like we said last night, he uses the verb see, re'eh, on either the last day of Sivan or the next to last day of Sivan, the third month. They're going to do most of this exploration during the fourth month, the month of Tammuz. That month is associated with the tribe of Reuven. Reuben. And he's named because Leah says, see a son. So sight, vision, is associated with the fourth month. And that's exactly what Moses tells them. The month is about to flip over. And remember, what you see on the first day of that month is going to set the tone for what happens the rest of that month. For instance, it was the first of Av, if I'm not mistaken, first of Av, that sounds right, when you could first see the mountaintops after the flood. And so what did that tell you? There's been a change on the first of Av, and the waters are going to begin to recede, and then they're going to continue receding for several days. But that set the tone. He could see the mountains. He says, okay, we've just had a breakthrough here. And so the rest of this month is going to be the recession of the water as part of the continuing of those mountains appearing. So more and more of what he saw on the first of Av, he will continue seeing until the water completely recedes. And so he's preparing them for the first of Av, the first of Tammuz, which is the fourth month, which is the month you're supposed to see things. And like we said last night, I think Moshe was hoping that they would see a son, as he had on the mountain, because remember, later on the Mount of Transfiguration, the disciples are looking, Yeshua is engulfed in this glorious cloud, and then they see him talking with Moshe. And so I believe that time ceased to exist to Moses on that mountain. Certainly explains how he could go 40 days and 40 nights without food or water. And that he's able to see the sun, and he's able to see the tree, which is, I think that's why that's the critical information when he says, is there a tree in it? As he sends them out, he wants to know if they can see what he saw. And I think he wants to know if they can see the sun. Because even Abraham, Yeshua said, he saw my day and he rejoiced. He was able to see beyond his own time period. So later in Deuteronomy 143, as Moshe is continuing this lecture, he mentions the Amorites again. Remember, the hill country of the Amorites is where they're going to be able to now see into the land. And he says, so I spoke to you, but you would not listen. Now there's a different sense that he's pulling into this. It was see, right? See it. Now, in this recap, he's saying, you would not listen. Not only did they not see what they were supposed to see, they did not hear what they were supposed to hear. So he says, you wouldn't listen. Instead, you rebelled against the command of the Lord and acted presumptuously and went up into the hill country. The Amorites who lived in that hill country came out against you and chased you as bees, like bees, in the same manner that a bee chases human beings. And the play on word there is bees, right there is hadbarim. And you can hear Devarim, the title of the Torah portion. It means words or things. And you're always going to be tested in the midbar, you can hear that root word, in regard to the Devar. He's going to test you to see if you are prepared to cross over into the land, into the garden. And if you can be tested and prevail and overcome in your testing of the Devar, which is why you hear that phrase over and over and over in Revelation. He that overcomes what? This period of testing as it relates to the word in your heart. And so they were tested in regard to the word. They disobeyed the command. They didn't obey the command when they were supposed to go up and see. And so they come back down and say, okay, that window's closed, so don't go up now. And then they would not listen. Not only did they see, they wouldn't listen. So they go up. They transgress the commandment again. This time to listen. Don't do it. And so the tripwire, the hill country of the Amorites, that threshold they had reached, says the Amorites came out of the hill country and chased you like bees would chase you. And they crushed you from Seir to Hormah. And in the commentary, I'm not sure if it's Rashi or somewhere else I read it, but I remember it because it's funny. When a bee stings you, it can die. And they said that's what happened to the Amorites, is that even though the Amorites chased them and crushed them, the second they would strike an Israelite, they would die like a bee had expended its stinger. So even in the punishment of the Israelites for transgressing the commandment, the instrument of his punishment was punished as well. And that's a lesson that the world needs to see. If Adonai uses you to punish and to discipline his people, then you'd best not get all puffed up and think you're wonderful, because it may be the fact that you are the instrument also means that you are the instrument of your own destruction. Because he doesn't have to say that. He can just say they went out against you and chased you. But he said, no, he says, like bees. And this particular manner, Devarim. He says, then you returned and wept before the Lord, but the Lord did not listen to your voice, nor give ear to you. You won't listen, he won't listen. And so here's the contrast that we went through last week as it concerns what should the spies have remembered. They should have remembered way back at the mountain, Moses had explained to them that going into the land was not going to be the result of natural war and battle, that he was going to send this supernatural hornet, is the translation. It's a bug, the tzirah. He's going to send this hornet before them, and little by little, they're going to be able to take their inheritance. But it's not their war, it's his. And so Moses has promised them a supernatural book. But when they decide to go to war and do it for themselves, then a different kind of bug comes out and chases them. You don't want to believe in a supernatural bug? Well, I can make you believe in a natural bug. Then it says they returned and they wept. And that's exactly what we've had. We've had weeping for generations on the 9th of Av because of this incident. And the month of Av, when they would have gone out to battle, is associated with the tribe of Shimon. And remember, Shimon's name has to do with hearing. Adonai has heard my grief. And so hearing, the attribute of hearing, the sense of hearing, is associated with the tribe of Shimon and the month of Av. So as we turn over this month tomorrow into the tribe of Shimon, then whereas we should have had great vision during the month of Tammuz, really keeping our eyes, our spiritual eyes open, and seeing what Scripture says we should see, not what the natural world tells us we should see. So tomorrow, to that quality of higher vision, spiritual vision, we want to add the quality of spiritual hearing. We want to hear Shema Yisrael, because that's coming. As Moshe goes through this recap, he's going to remind them of the Shema. Hear, O Israel. It's vital that you hear. And so there's the retelling. When it says the bees chased you, Devarim. If we skip over to Deuteronomy 6:6, we know that he's going to use again this play on word, because in the Shema, which tells us to hear, remember that's the the first of Av, we start thinking about hearing for that month. So he's going to follow up here in this upcoming Torah portion and repeat the Shema, so that in that month we will hear Shema, hear, Just like Moses told us to see when we should have been seeing, now he's going to tell us to hear when we should be hearing. And the Shema says, and these words, Hadvarim, that I command you today shall be upon your heart. Okay. So there's our root word again, Devar. So when we put the word in our hearts, when we hear the word, when we set our hearts to understand the Devar, then it's just like putting Varim there. It's like putting bees in our heart. And when we have to go into battle, when we're going to be tested according to word, according to the Devar, then that very Devar, those very Devarim, will go out and do battle against our enemies on our behalf, which is a beautiful layer of Devarim. Yes, I'm being tested according to the word, but I want to hide the word, the Devarim, in my heart so that I might not sin. When I hide the Devar in my heart, then I don't sin. And then when I am tested in regard to sin, then the very word that I have hidden there becomes the Devarim that are going to go out and battle for me. So we've got these seasons here, the exploration of the spies, where we need to be finely tuned in our seeing the word and hearing the word. Be very, very cautious about engaging new battles that you are not sure the Father wants you to fight. This is a season where you kind of stand back, like at the crossing of the Reed Sea, just stand still and see the salvation. Okay, also in this season, he's saying, hide that word in your heart. And what you may find out is that I'll go before you. And if you won't be lured into a battle I didn't invite you to, it may be that you find out that I cleared the way for you and you just walk through it. Because if you go out presumptuously at this season, you can always repent. The gates of repentance are always open. You may be forgiven, but it doesn't mean that he's obligated to restore that opportunity immediately. Sometimes he opens a window, he opens a door, and if you don't respond quickly with obedience, then he'll say that time is over and he'll shut that door. And then you can't go back later and force it open. That's why I say be careful about your battles. Make sure you're listening. Make sure you're seeing what you should see. It's better to be careful and measured at this season. And so in Deuteronomy 2, going forward to verse 14, what we see is that, yes, it was the Israelites who were sinning, but he points out particularly the men of war. Because remember, it had to be men of war who made this presumptuous decision to take up arms once the window was closed, and then they basically get their rear ends kicked all the way to Seir, which couldn't have been a pleasant journey down in that part of the land. But he points out that they're doomed to die. He says, now the time that it took for us to come from Kadesh Barnea until we crossed over the brook Zered was 38 years, until all the generation of the men of war, see how he's pointing that out? The men of war perished from within the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. Moreover, the hand of the Lord was against them to destroy them from within the camp until they all perished. So it came about when all the men of war had finally perished from among the people. That's what we want to do. We want to look for a phrase that's repeated, the men of war. So our question is, well, why is he pointing out that the men of war needed to die? Well, number one, people who like to just fight, they're probably going to be trouble just regardless. But I think if we look at last week's lesson, what the role Moshe expected from the explorers versus what the explorers thought their role was. And so when they return and they bring this evil report, and remember, the evil report is predicated upon the assumption that Adonai is not going to help them at all. He brought them this far, pushed them out of the car, and drove on. And somehow they're going to have to, kill the giants and take the fortified cities. And that's not what Moshe told them at all. He says, the tzirah, the hornet's going to go before you and clear it out little by little, maybe not as fast as you want. It's never as fast as we want. Nevertheless, at his pace, to the degree that we can handle it, he's going to clear out with the hornets. And so once they refuse, on the 9th of Av, he says, okay, you're not going to go in. You're going to have to die out in the wilderness. The men of war are the ones who decide to go anyway. And I think it goes back to what we were saying last week. Moses had simply told them to go up and inherit the land. When they got to the tripwire, when they got to the hills of the Amorites, he says, go up and inherit your land. He didn't say strap on a sword. It's the people who come to Moses and asked to send out scouts to see what the land looked like. They haven't needed a scout up to this point. And so they get right at the gate and they say, well, we better scout this thing out. Even though they had been told that the tzirah would go before him, when it came down to the battle, there was no need to get upset. There was no need to be terrified. You're just going to walk in. In fact, we could see as the journey begins, we're told that he took them by an alternate route so they would not see war. He doesn't intend for this inheritance of the land to be a violent thing, at least not for the Israelites. He's going to take care of that. If there's any violence, if there's any battle, if there's any war, the Holy One is going to see to that on their behalf. And then came Amalek. They end up in a fight with Amalek, and it was the stragglers that they attacked. According to the tradition, it was those who had already been ejected out of the cloud for bad behavior. So we can see two different sets of expectations. The 10 spies think they're bringing back a military intelligence report. They're bringing back what they see in the natural realm. Moses thought they're going to go up the mountain, ascend the mountain like he did, see a tree, see the sun. He's expecting them to have a supernatural experience. He doesn't expect that their experience of the divine presence should change just because they're going into the land. He expects that they would continue to walk with that cloud mentality of saying, you know what? Our daily bread is supernatural. The clothes on our backs are supernatural. They don't wear out. The shoes on our feet are supernatural. They don't wear out. Everything about our lives is not normal. It's not earthbound. And so having been enjoying that up to this time, why should they go on this exploration, the goal of the mission, and then all of a sudden see things only in the natural realm? But that seems to be their default setting. And that's why these men of war are going to have to die out in the wilderness. They are not ready to carry that faith that would actually take them up when they go to the land. And they would be more likely to bring the land down to their level because that's the report they brought back, a natural report. So this tzirah, that supernatural hornet, we hear about it again. We know that Moshe had access to it, and maybe next week or the next week, I'm going to go over the tzirah, the supernatural bug again. For any of those who didn't see it in the Revived General Session, plus that was just basically an overview. It'll take a little more time to go through most of the material on the supernatural hornet, the sources, how it works, where it works, and so forth, and then relating it again to what you're seeing in Revelation. But everything you're seeing in Revelation is based on what you're reading back here in the Tanakh about the hornet. So at the end of Joshua's generation, he's doing the same thing that Moses did in this Torah portion. Moshe's given the recap. This is what happened. This is our experience. Here's the summary. And so at the end of his life, Yehoshua is doing the same thing. He's led the people into the land. And in Joshua 24:12 through 13, and then skipping on to verse 28, so I can show you the comparison between the two, between Moshe and Yehoshua. Yehoshua tells the Israelites, you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. And the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and the Amorite. Remember the tripwire. He says, thus I gave them into your hand. Then I sent the hornet, tzirah, before you, and it drove out the two kings of the Amorites from before you. Now these were Amorites who had chased the Israelites like bees at the time of Moses. But now when Joshua goes in, when he crosses the Jordan, there's something different about his men of war. They listen. They see what they're supposed to see. And so he tells them, it drove out the two kings of the Amorites from before you, but not by your sword or your bow. In other words, these warriors understood what it meant to be a warrior in the cloud. They allowed the hornet, the tzirah, to do what it was supposed to do, and they're basically the mop-up crew. They move in and get the loot. But the true power of the army was not in the natural realm. It was in their obedience and in their faith, in the Devar. And if you have obedience and faith in the Devar and the one who gave the Devar, then you don't have to worry about Hadvarim chasing after you. You don't even have to worry about your sword and your bow. And then it says, Joshua dismissed the people, each to his inheritance. And that's what Moshe had tried to tell them when they came to the hills of the Amorites. Go up and inherit. He didn't say, go arm yourself with sword and bow. He said, go up and inherit. And instead, they start fabricating this elaborate thing about, okay, now we need scouts. Now we need a reconnaissance mission. And so that's what happens. When we don't believe the word, we're just saying we don't believe the one who gave the word. But if we can believe the word, then the greatest battles we ever fight are the ones we don't. The ones where we just stand and watch him do it on our behalf. And here's another hint. Remember what Yehoshua said. You didn't even draw your sword or your bow in this battle where he drives out the Amorites with the tzirah. So he's saying, I want you to, even Joshua, he's saying what Moses says, I want you to know the difference between natural warfare and supernatural warfare. Because the one that you serve, his weapons, remember that passage, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, they're not fleshly, they're not natural, but they're mighty through the Holy Spirit. And that's what Moses was trying to tell them. You're not going to conquer this land with your sword and your bow. You're going to conquer it with the power of the Holy Spirit and your obedience. And that's why you need the Holy Spirit to be obedient. The power of obedience is enduring when it's with the power of the Holy Spirit. If it's simply, I'm afraid I'm going to get struck dead if I don't obey, oh, if I must, those are the wrong attitudes. That's evidence of spirit. You're not letting the spirit work through that commandment. But when you allow the spirit to blow through that commandment, then it becomes power in your life. Then it's like you releasing the bees out of your heart to just chase people down and confuse them and bite them. And it's the best weapon to have. It's like the sword of the spirit is much more powerful than a literal sword. So we're constantly being reminded, actually, the difference between natural warfare and supernatural warfare. So, okay, the hornet, a natural bee, a natural hornet, yeah, that's scary. If we look at the F-18 Hornet, if you see this booger loaded up with all its missiles and guns, that's even scarier. But here is the most terrifying thing. The word. Hadvarim, the words. These are the words. Those words should strike fear and horror into the hearts of our enemies. When we obey this word, that's the most terrifying weapon you have at your disposal. Because see, it's up to you to obey the word, but it's up to the Father to perform it. And that's the difference. Natural, supernatural. Natural, supernatural. And we all probably right this second got the supernatural within our reach. We can put a hand on it. If not, then it's at least it's probably on a screen in front of us, depending on how you read your Bible. You have the little book. You have the scroll. And if you're obedient to it, there's no reason for it to turn bitter in your stomach. So we're going to do a little detective work on these tourists/warriors. Remember last week, Moses said their role was to latur, which is to explore, to meander, to walk around and get acquainted. He's saying, this is the place I've prepared for you. It sounds just like Yeshua. In my Father's house, there's many rooms, there's many realms. I go to prepare a place for you. And that's one of the most, let me use some very poor English. That's one of the most funnest things you can do in the land of Israel is walk around and say, will this be my home? Will this be my home? Because you know that there's more there than what you can see with your physical eye. And it really gets you in tune with your spirit. You start thinking with more than just a physical brain. You start hearing with more than a physical ear. You start seeing with more than a natural eye, because you're trying to tune in to that realm that Yeshua freely walked into and out of when he walked the land. And you're trying to sense, is this my home? Am I home here? Because you know you're home in Jerusalem. But Jerusalem was 3 times a year. You know, in the kingdom, there's still going to be a lot of natural things going on. So here's what it says in Numbers 13:2. He said, send out for yourself men so that they may, and I crossed out the English translation spy. And I put explore, which is, I think, a little more consistent with what Moses sent them to do. And the Hebrew word there is ve yaturu. And you can see that Hebrew verb latur. Latur is the infinitive. He says, I want you to explore out the land of Canaan, which I am going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of their father's tribes, everyone a leader among them. Now, I've taught you about smichut, where something is placed. You put this thing next to this thing, and even though they might seem to be completely different topics, somehow the one is explaining the other. So in the Torah portion where he says, send out explorers, send out tourists into the land of Canaan that I'm going to give you. In fact, he already said, I've given it to you, past tense, when we looked at the other passage. He gave it to you. When they reached the hills of the Amorites, he said, he gave it to you. And so it's interesting to me that there's a tense change right here. Because now that the people have asked for spies, have asked for explorers, now Moses seems to shift too. He says, well, that I'm going to give. It's almost like there's an acknowledgement something horrible has already happened, even before he sends them out and they come back with the bad report. It's like he can almost sense that it's not going to be right when they come back. At any rate, in that same parsha, we get the commandment of tzitzit. And when we're looking, again, when we're applying the rule of progressive mention, and that means I find the first mention of a particular word or phrase, and then hopefully I'm using a search engine instead of trying to dig it out myself, but I put that phrase in there, and then I end up with a list of everywhere in Scripture that phrase was used or that word was used. And then I go back and very meticulously read those usages in context. And when I do that, it helps me build an understanding of the word or the phrase. And then I'll begin to see the pattern of it. And so when I see latour as the verb there, I want you to go explore. I want you to walk around. I want you to get acquainted with our new home. Then I see in the very same parasha, and it's not a word that's used every other verse, by the way. So when we do see it again, we say, oh, this is going to be important, and it is, because it occurs in the context of wearing tzitzit. If you'll remember, there was a Sabbath breaker, and so we have to make a judgment. This guy is intentionally breaking the Shabbat. What do we do? Well, once that judgment is rendered, it's followed with the commandment of tzitzit. And Numbers 15:39, he says, it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord so as to do them. And watch this. And not follow after vaturu, your own heart and your own eyes, after which you played the harlot, so that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy to your God. So remember, Moshe said, see. When they get to the Amorite hills, he says, see, look at the land. You have this commandment to go into the land. Look at it, see it, perform it, just do it, walk in it. And so when we go back and we see that latour, exploring the land, is the expectation, in the very same Torah portion, he says, okay, and to help you remember to do the commandments, to look at them, I want you to make tzitzit in the corners of your garments, so that you will look at those and they will remind you what your eyes should be seeing. Because the mistake you've made is, instead of looking at the commandments, instead of looking at the Devarim that I've given you, you chose to look into your own heart and into your own eyes. And those are natural. You have to lift your eyes to see what's in my heart and to see Israel through my eyes. Because if you don't, you'll start playing the harlot. And you'll forget to do all my commandments. What you look at is vital. And so he gives them tzitziot like a visual shema. Look at them. See, shema means hear, O Israel. And if you remember this shema, it's all about speaking. You shall speak of them. You shall put these words on your heart. You shall speak of them. When you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you retire, what are you doing? You're speaking. So you can hear it. But tzitziot are your visual shema. It's your visual way to hear. You can see it with your eyes. So he says to look at, re'u, so that you don't vaturu, the way that the spies did, after their own heart and eyes. You want to look at the tzitzit and see them in action. See, this guy apparently had a conception of Shabbat as an idea, but not an action. Unless you do Shabbat, it's just a precept. It's a philosophy. It's a doctrine. It's something to be debated. But you have to do it. And so he says, put these tzitzit on your garments, and it's going to remind you that Shabbat is an action. It's going to remind you that the commandments are an action. When you see and when you hear, it requires action. The same way that Moses said, Re'u, look at the land of your inheritance. It's going to require something of you, but not what you think, not war. He's taking care of that. So he's saying, don't take a tour around yourself. Take a tour using my eyes. Take a tour using my ears, and then you'll do the right things. And so when they brought back the evil report, it's evidence they didn't listen and they didn't look. Not with spiritual eyes, not with spiritual ears. So let's back up just a little. We're still looking for la tour. Here we saw that it was connected with the tzitzit, baturu. Don't follow after your own heart. Don't take a tour around your own self. Okay, I think I can advance it. There it is. So we're going to go back to Numbers 10:33. We want to go to where even before the explorers were sent out. We're going to back up even farther back. We're looking for, what does la tour really mean? What is it supposed to mean? When I'm touring, what am I supposed to be doing? That sounded very New England. In Numbers 10:33, it says, thus they set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey, with the ark of the covenant of the Lord journeying in front of them for the 3 days, to seek out a resting place for them. Latur lahem menucha. What do you do on Shabbat? You rest. And so this mention of Latur tells you when we go exploring, it means simply to follow the cloud and do what the cloud is doing. Follow the ark, which has the Devarim in it, the commandments in it, the words, and do what the ark is doing. It's not rocket science. If the ark's moving, move. If the ark's resting, rest. It says the cloud of the Lord was over them by day when they set out from the camp. It's over them. I know we always think of the pillar of cloud, but there was more clouds than just that cloud. And that's what Paul says, we were all under the cloud. So this cloud, known as clouds of glory or Sukkot of glory, was understood. They walked into it when they left Ramses. They went to Sukkot. From there, they went into Sukkot of glory, these clouds. And they were protection for them. And that's when they began to enter into a supernatural realm on earth. And it says it was over them by day when they set out from the camp. Then it came about when the ark set out that Moses said, rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. When it came to rest, he said, return, O Lord, to the myriad thousands of Israel. And so there's some real irony, because now we know what happened later. That the Israelite men of war went out to war when Moses said don't. They didn't do what he said to do, which is don't war. Just go look at it. And then they say, okay, now we're going to go to war. He's like, don't do that. They went out to war anyway. They got, eaten alive. And it says that they returned and they wept, like tshuva. But see, it was too late. They had already violated the rest that they could have enjoyed. Imagine how much rest they would have had in inheriting their land, as opposed to the fight. Think of how much rest we could have in our battles, as opposed to the fight, if we truly saw and we truly heard the word, if we truly moved when the cloud moved, and we truly moved when the ark moved, and when it stopped, we stopped. See, if the world would stop on Shabbat, they'd get a lot further. They think they get further when they work on Shabbat. The truth is just the opposite. If you will rest on Shabbat and quit moving, then you will actually advance in the long run. But you have to see and you have to hear. You can't be like the Sabbath breaker. You have to rest when the ark rests. You have to rest when the cloud rests. And so the Sabbath breaker, he becomes this remembrance, this catalyst for the Israelites from ever since, who were tzitzit. They can look back at this one man who didn't look. They can look back at this one man who didn't hear. He didn't come to rest when the ark rested. He toured around after his own heart and eyes, and he disregarded the movement of the cloud, in this case, the lack of movement. It was resting. So, these clouds of glory, or Sukkot of glory, in the Jewish tradition, there's much more information about it. Even though we have lots of information about the movement of the cloud, we tend to run through it really fast because it looks repetitious, but every repetition gives you more information about the cloud. And that's why I loved writing that book, 50,000 Degrees and Cloudy, because most people don't even consider the depth of information in the movement of those clouds. But once they entered into the clouds of glory, they were understood to be a supernatural protection. It was their new dwelling place after they left Sukkot in Egypt. The cloud and the ark were only going to move at divinely appointed times. Why is it so important for us to obey the appointed times? Because that's our way of following the ark and the cloud, even in the place of our exile. See, they had to be in the wilderness. You're still in exile if you're in the wilderness. You have to learn to move with the ark and the cloud. What are we doing out here? He's teaching us how to move with the ark and the cloud. And he's teaching us how to rest with the ark and the cloud, with his commandments, with his word. If the ark and the cloud didn't move, the people didn't move. And what did they have? They had the voice of Adonai that spoke from above the ark. So they were hearing. And then the cloud gave them heavenly tzitzit to look upon. See, the Sabbath gatherer, he had something supernatural, something divine, something glorious to look upon. He had those white clouds on that blue of heaven. He had divine tzitzit he could have looked upon. Just imagine what those clouds would have looked like swirling in a blue sky. Heavenly tzitzit. And he couldn't see it, and he couldn't hear it. Because he couldn't hear and see the supernatural. He couldn't get that the Spirit does the work. It's just our job to be in tune with that Spirit, to move when it moves and to rest when it rests. Because if you're in the cloud, if you're in a state of obedience to the Devar, he's given supernatural food, supernatural water, supernatural clothes, supernatural shoes, and even healing. It says their feet didn't even swell up. And the rabbis take a look at that and say, maybe there's, when he says he does this, maybe he literally means it's true. Because one of the things they say about that is that he literally carried them. You know how his word says he carried them? Well, they take that as like literal. The cloud literally carried them. They didn't have to put that one foot in front of the other in those rocks and sand. That they elevated. Think of Yeshua walking on the water. That what is holding you up is what's not there. At least not what you can see. Something you can't see is more solid than what you can see. So he's saying, follow the cloud. Believe in the power of the Holy Spirit to move you in the proper season and to rest you at the proper season. And if you can believe that, then you can also believe that he will scatter all your enemies. Those enemies will see the cloud coming and they'll scatter. Because he'll send the hornet ahead of us. If we can hide his word in our hearts, he can send the bees out before us. So, when we see Moses is telling the Israelites to go explore the land, that little bit of detective work we did, just looking at 3 contexts for la tour. What does it mean to explore, to walk around, to meander, to tour the land? I think we can draw some conclusions. Some of the Israelites had disconnected from the cloud and the ark. They rejected the ark and the cloud as their tour guides. And when they began moving of their own initiative, their own eyes and ears, then they lost the scattering action of the tzitzit cloud. Had they gathered into the cloud properly in obedience, then the enemies would have been scattered before them. When they moved of their own initiative, they declined a supernatural entry over the Jordan. Remember, they were walking on clouds. They weren't walking normally in that cloud. And not only did they forfeit the privilege of crossing the Jordan, being carried by the cloud, they lost the benefit of the hornet going before them. That generation of men of war had to die because they thought they were the tzirah. Now, later, just like Joshua mentions, he's going to use it later in his generation. But we can see, and as we get into that study on the tzirah, we'll see it looks like Moses was able to send that hornet ahead when he was fighting Sihon and Og east of the Jordan. But it's a generation later that Yehoshua is going to have to use it to clear out the land itself so that the people can go in. And then finally, when Israelites start moving ahead of the cloud, it's because they believed that their natural military power was the way that they were going to inherit. And that's not the way you inherit. So here's what the Midrash says. And this is the Midrash says to the Devarim volume, page 23. So I just put it on here verbatim. With Moses speaking to the Israelites. He says, I rebutted you. He who has wrought miracles in the past will do so again. Hasn't the Almighty manifested his great love for you by carrying you on clouds of glory through the wilderness? Among their other miraculous functions, the clouds transported the tzaddikim of Bnei Yisrael so that they did not need to walk through the wilderness. He said, God has treated you as a father cares for his little son. He carried you, just like the father carries his child on his shoulders and shields him from every danger. So you can see in the Midrash, they're accepting these clouds of glory as literally making them light on their feet so that they're not getting the natural, harsh, footfall by footfall swelling that comes into your feet in the natural realm. And in this lecture in Devarim, Moses even goes back into their deliverance from Egypt, and he keeps pointing out the supernatural aspects of the deliverance, of their wilderness experience, and how it seems like at every point they have rejected and doubted their ability to live this elevated life. Now, in hindsight, we think, oh man, if I had only had the opportunity, I doubt if it would have been any different because we don't even know how to live in the generation we're in half the time. All we want to do is complain about it instead of just listening and seeing what he told us to listen to and to see, to hide that word in our hearts, and then to stand back and let the Devarim go fight the battles for us. And if we can't even do that, then how are we going to be prepared for the great tzirah? I mean, that number, what, in the millions? When they come out of the abyss? We want to be ready for that so that we don't misinterpret the mission of the tzirah and become frightened of it. So what do we see about the cloud here? He provided everything for them in that cloud. But Moses is pointing out to them that they have violated the most ancient laws of hospitality that are still practiced in the Middle and the Near East. If you go eat with a Bedouin, you will never experience hospitality so great. Those who have the least still put everything they have out there. It's called panim chamim. It means like warmth of face. Hospitality. And so the Father has invited the Israelites to ascend out of Egypt and begin a journey with their betrothed. He's their betrothed. He's their bridegroom. And so at the covenant, which they've had a series of covenants, but at Sinai, what we realize is, yeah, there's stipulations to this covenant, just like there is in any marriage. But there are three things that a husband is obligated to provide for his wife by Torah law: food, covering, and intimacy. And he gives them all three of those things. Even before they reach the land, he gives them supernatural food. He gives them manna straight from heaven. It comes down with the dew. He gives them their coverings. He covers them with the cloud. He puts the cloud over them. And so their clothes don't wear out. Their shoes don't wear out. And third, intimacy. A husband is obligated to give his wife intimacy, his presence. And that's exactly what he gives them. He gives them his very presence, to walk in his presence. He gives them the ark. And so he provides everything he's obligated to give them, not just in a natural way, but in a supernatural way. And time after time, and he points out the men of war, the people who want to fight about it, they reject those provisions, and they would rather have food from Egypt. They would rather have Egyptian clothes. They would rather not have his presence so close, because there's such a huge obligation that goes with that in terms of obedience. The closer you are to him, the more likely you are to be, punished harshly, like Nadav and Abihu. They were really close to the presence and they went out really fast. They don't want the obedience that goes with intimacy. That's what it amounts to. And, one thing I wanted to point out, the fact that they didn't like the manna, that they were craving meat. They wanted natural flesh instead of supernatural bread. Even in the natural realm, that's the greatest act of disrespect. Not just in that day and time, but in this day and time. In that culture, if someone invites you into their home, if they invite you to a meal and they serve you a dish, the ultimate insult would be to request something different or to disparage the meal. And that's exactly what they do. I know when I was little, shreds of that, I think, are in other cultures. When I was little and we went to somebody's house for a meal, I knew better than to be picky about my food when I went to somebody else's house. I might have despised Brussels sprouts, but if that's what they served, then I better choke one down without complaining. And so My mom taught me that precept. You don't go into somebody's house who's preparing a meal for you and complain about the food. That's not the time to be picky. You choke it down and move on. But with manna, it shouldn't have been a matter of choking it down. What they couldn't choke down was the obedience to that word that they were taking into their bodies. And so what was happening? The men of war were having a war of the natural flesh, cravings of the natural flesh against the craving of the spirit. And for the men of war, we know who won the battle. But we can see that for some reason, these men of war favor the natural war over the obedience that could have kept them in the cloud, and they would have seen their enemies just supernaturally scattered in front of it. And that's what they say. The Amalekites are said to have attacked those who'd already been ejected out of the cloud. And so they also reject the intimacy. They reject the presence at Sinai. They say, Moses, you go up the mountain and come back and tell us what he said. He's just too close to us right here. We're not ready to experience this. But the second Moses is out of sight, they're already devising plans. And so while they're having trouble standing in the presence of the Holy One, they don't have any trouble at all dancing and prancing around with a golden calf. They don't mind being intimate with an idol, but they don't want the intimacy of the one who delivered them from slavery and is about to bring them into a land of covenant. So like I say, they hadn't needed scouts up to this time to get them anywhere. They just followed the cloud and followed the ark to know when to move and to know when to rest. And had they heard Shema, had they seen the tzitzit cloud, the Spirit could have elevated them to this supernatural level that the land of Israel really is. It's above the natural level that the natural eye sees. They could have seen the giants destroyed. Even if the cities were fortified to heaven, those strongholds would have been brought down by obedience. Imagine that. If I had just obeyed, all these things would have happened. In fact, that's the only way to destroy those strongholds in the land, is obedience. You see, these natural enemies of Israel, their roots are in evil strongholds. There's all sorts of realms of heaven. Paul talks about the third heaven, which would be the lower garden or paradise. But there's more realms other than that. And so it's telling you that the culture of the Canaanites, of the Amorites, of all these ites, it's not really rooted in the natural realm. It's rooted in evil strongholds in a realm that we don't really see. We sense it, that that's where they're drawing their power from. The only way we're going to uproot those natural forces that reflect the evil forces they're tapped into is by our obedience. Until the army of Israel follows the cloud, walks in the cloud, follows the commandments, walks in the commandments, until they follow the ark instead of trying to lead the ark, until the army wraps itself in tzitzit and wraps itself in the cloud, those strongholds are going to remain right where they are, because you can't kill them in the natural way. You must kill them in a supernatural way. And that's simply through obedience. And then when that happens, the Spirit of Adonai goes before you and destroys. In fact, if you look in the Gesenius Hebrew lexicon, it says that a cloud, anan, is a metaphor for a great army. Had Israel remained in the cloud, remained in the words, remained in the Spirit, they would have been a great army that prevailed by not lifting a finger around a sword, but simply by being obedient. And I think this is how Yeshua walked on water. Same principle. He was obedient. He is our model of obedience. He could walk on water. He could walk through a crowd that couldn't see him. He was overshadowed by clouds of glory outside of his time, his natural time. He walked in Sukkot of glory, and he was telling his disciples, look up, see what's not here. Because that's more real than what you can see. And we're told that he's going to return the same way he left, in a cloud. So the lesson we learned from the Israelites is, if we follow the works of our own hands and focus on the works of our own hands, if we focus on our own security, our own appetite, we might possibly miss the ride. A cloud is coming, and I think we're already in a cloud of sorts. And that cloud manifests itself when a disciple, when an Israelite decides to obey. When an Israelite decides to believe, all of a sudden you're in a cloud that you weren't in before. But as long as we rely on our self-security, remember, touring after ourselves, touring our own selves, as long as we want these secure benefits of Egypt, as long as we long for what's in the natural realm, because see, they kept saying, we want to go back to Egypt because we could humanly manipulate the canals and the irrigation. We could make things grow when we wanted them to. We didn't have to wait on this God. We didn't have to be obedient to a certain God. We could just eat in the natural realm. They were saying they weren't ready for a supernatural land, where in order to receive the dew and the rain, they had to maintain dependence, not independence. They had to maintain intimacy. You don't remain there through the works of your own hands. You don't remain there by building new barns. You remain there because you remain in intimacy with your bridegroom, and you depend upon him to give you your dew and your rain in its season. And what is that dew and the rain? Deuteronomy 32:32 tells us it's the word, the Devar, the Torah. Remember, the manna fell with the dew. It fell with the word, and the cloud covers it. That's our security. So we'll wrap up here. I wanted to move through these slides at the end, which is your homework, if you choose to do it. I hope you have a study partner or partners. So we're going to stick with 2 Corinthians 10, 1 through 11, which is Paul writing. And here are the questions. And there's 10 total. So based on what we've learned last night and today, I want you to go through that passage written to the Corinthians and see if you can pull down similar patterns, right? Because it's really full. It's almost like, again, he is teaching this Torah portion. Okay.
Will you show page 2 again, please?